This conference is brought to you by the North Central SARE, Sustainable Ag Research and Education Program. And let's get started. So the first speaker today is one of my favorites, Linda Prokopy. She is currently the department head for the Horticulture and Landscape Architecture department at Purdue University. And one of very few people who, when I reached out to see if she would like to speak, she asked what she should speak on. And my initial thought was, pretty much whatever you want is going to be exactly applicable to this group today. So with that, I'll hand it right over.
I was so focused on my screen share, I forgot to unmute myself. So given that I had free reign, I'm going to talk about my favorite topic, which is what motivates farmers to adopt conservation practices in general, but for the purposes of this audience, climate smart, climate friendly practices. And I've done a lot of research in this space over the last 18 years and also reviewed most of the literature from within the US. So there has been a lot of work done across the US trying to understand what motivates farmers to adopt different practices. In recent years, of course, a lot of that literature has focused on cover crops, but 30 years ago, a lot of literature focused on no-till and other types of practices. We have, along with several colleagues, reviewed this literature. And so what I'm going to do today is talk about general findings from that literature and how I think it all holds together into a theory of understanding farmer behavior. And then I'll give some specific examples, and all of the specific examples come from my own work here in the Midwestern US. And actually, most of the research across the country is focused in the Midwest, where most of the people who do this kind of research seem to be located. So this is my big picture theory of what motivates farmers to adopt practices. It's a merger of diffusion of innovations, which several of you in Extension will be familiar with. That's Everett Rogers' pretty famous model for behavior adoption. And the theory of planned behavior, which is a more social psychological theory that explains behaviors in a number of different realms. But I've merged them together here. And what I'm going to do is talk through each of these boxes and then give examples as we go through. So first box is background factors. We know, of course, that who a person is and what their personal situation is an important determinant of whether or not they're likely to adopt a practice. If we look at personal characteristics, there are things like sociodemographics, of course, that can explain behavior adoption. And so we know, for example, that the older a farmer is, the less likely they are to adopt a practice. The more educated a farmer is, the more likely they are to adopt a practice. I don't tend to focus a lot on those sociodemographics when I do talks like this, or even in my own research, because they're not things that are easy to change. So they're not as interesting as some other variables where I think we can have some more direct impact in our work. The other type of personal characteristic I do think is super important in explaining behavior adoption, and is a place where we can think about trying to have some impact, are people's underlying values and personalities. So we know that farmers with a stewardship identity are more likely to adopt practices than other farmers, but also farmers with an innovator identity. So farmers who like to tinker and play around and try new things are much more likely to try new practices. Farmers who are systems thinkers are more likely to adopt practices that require more of that type of thinking, right? So for example, cover crops. We see farmers who adopt cover crops are much more likely to think about their whole farm in a holistic way than other types of farmers. And also farmers who are active seekers and users of information. So people who are actively going out to field days, reading things on websites, and engaging with others to learn new information. Farm characteristics are also very important, of course, in whether or not a practice gets adopted on a particular farm. We know that livestock can be important, but there tends to be more practice adoption on farms with livestock. Farm size is another determinant. So the larger the farm, the more likely there is to be practice adoption. And finally, my last little picture here is of soil erosion. The more vulnerable land is, the more likely we are to see practices adopted there. This final background factor here of farm context is one that I don't think we spend enough time thinking about or talking about. It's hard to change. It's very nebulous. It includes lots and lots of variables that sort of collectively are structural in nature, right? So there are things that is really hard for us in our daily work to change. So, for example, commodity prices, right? We don't have a lot of impact over commodity prices, but they sure do affect how farmers act. The climate is another one that we can't control, but we can certainly help inform farmers and maybe try to change how they interact with that context a little bit. Laws and policies, of course, form part of that context, as does what generally is going on in that farming community. Is there another group of people who are adopting practices? Is there an active watershed management group, et cetera? All of those things can be very influential. The next thing that influences whether or not a practice is adopted is the practice itself. And what are the characteristics of those practices? So relative advantage is a practice more beneficial than what I'm currently doing? Is it too complex? Is it compatible with my other practices? Can I observe it? Is it trialable? And is it risky? What is the risk of adopting this practice? What you can see already as this theory evolves, right, is that the background factors very much interact with practice characteristics to determine whether or not a practice gets adopted. So a farmer who has a larger farm, for example, might be more likely to think a practice is trialable because they have enough acreage that they can trial a practice on a small number of acres without overly impacting their overall farm profitability. So you definitely see some interaction coming in there. We also start to see, when we think about these practice characteristics, differences between types of practices and principally between what I sort of will loosely call on-farm and off-farm practices, right? So edge of field practices like wetlands are perceived very, very differently than on-farm practices such as nutrient management or cover crop adoption. If we look at edge of field practices, it's the types of things that we hear when we talk to farmers, when we talk to conservation professionals such as yourselves about edge of field practices are really just how challenging they are, right? Some of those characteristics that make them really hard. It can be really hard to get them permitted. It can take a long time. It can take a long time. We see that quote a lot with these. It can also be very complex, right, in terms of transporting and dumping soil. That can cost a lot of money. It can put up the cost of things like oxbows, wetlands, other types of practices. Those quotes here all come from some focus groups that we did across the Midwest focused on adoption of edge of field practices last year, I think. And then some quotes here about cover crops as a different type of practice and what people think about cover crops. That I've never done cover crop, but I can see some benefits. But when you get looking at the financial end of it, and then the interim who's paying for that, for the producer and reduction in yields or whatever, so we start to see there's some benefits, right? But there's also some costs. And so overall, a practice is only going to be considered relatively advantageous if those benefits outweigh the costs. And so understanding what a farmer is thinking about that helps us to inform, helps us to work with them on understanding the benefits, but also helping to factor in what those costs are going to be. We've all identified that when you need to put cover crop on, if it's after harvest, it's not everybody has that time. So this is really a quote that speaks to the compatibility of a practice, right? Is this practice compatible with everything else going on in that farmer's life and in their farm management? Certainly for farmers who have off-farm income as well, it can be challenging to do a practice that takes a lot more time. If you're talking about cover crops, it's a timing thing. You get such small windows of time where you can do something that is a positive thing rather than a negative thing. I don't know how you throw cover crops into the mix when you're trying to take care of business. Again, is this compatible with everything else that's going on? Is it too complex because it's such a specific narrow window of time that a practice can be adopted? So we start to see how and these are all quotes from farmers, that when farmers are talking about some of these practices, you can start to pick up these different types of practice characteristics in the things that they are saying. All of those things interact, right? So someone's background factors, the actual practice that they're evaluating interact to form someone's attitudes towards a practice. And generally, someone's only going to adopt a practice if they have a positive attitude towards that practice. And that practice fits in with the other things that they're doing on their farm. The next thing here, so these three together, attitudes, norms, perceived behavioral control, are generally considered in some combination to speak to someone's intention to adopt a behavior. Norms, I think, is probably the most interesting of these three. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit more. We do know that, of course, norms mean what do other people think that I should do? There's different types of norm in the sociological literature. There's descriptive norms. So what are other people doing when I drive around my community? Do I see other people adopting these types of practices? There are also subjective norms, which is what do other people think I should do? And when we want to understand someone's subjective norms, it's really important to understand who is in that person's network. Who are they actively talking to? And this next, sorry, I think I've been showing my slides out of order. I apologize. I was looking at my presenter view, not my slide view. Okay, here we go. This next slide here, some of you have probably seen before. It's from a 2012 survey that we worked on, a joint effort between a couple of large USDA-funded projects where we surveyed, I think, I can remember, 19,000 farmers across the North Central region about who influences them when they make decisions about ag practices and strategies. And grouped from left to right, you can see how influential people are. So the most influential group is family, followed by chemical dealers, seed dealer, consultants, landlords, other farmers, and it goes on down the list. But looking at really at the left side of this, what you see is the private sector and the role of the private sector. And out of this work and some other work that Jay Arbuckle was doing at Iowa State, we've really been promoting the private sector and the public sector working together more to promote practice adoption. And we've seen some real benefits from that in different watersheds where that has been done. And that really speaks to the value of norms, right? If you as an extension educator, for example, go out and you can see extension down here in the middle of this list. If you as an extension educator go out and talk to a farmer about the benefits of a practice, and then they go and talk to their seed dealer who says, I know nothing about that practice, or I don't think that practice is very useful, where we can't really get past that norm of the seed dealer, right? And what that seed dealer thinks and how that's influencing the farmer. So it's important to talk to as many folks as possible. I'm going to do a little case study here of one of the projects that we recently completed, looking at what explains variation in county level adoption rates of cover crops across the three I states here, Illinois, Iowa, and Indiana. This work was funded by the Nature Conservancy, and we based our work on the remotely sensed data coming out of Optus that shows cover crop adoption, and conservation tillage adoption over years across at the county level. I can do it at different levels as well, but we were interested at the county level, what cover crop adoption looked like and what was going on. When you look at this data and you take some secondary data, so existing data, to try to understand cover crop adoption, we find several biophysical factors that impact cover crop adoption. So where there's higher temperatures, there's higher precipitation, we see more cover crop adoption. But we also see some sort of interesting patterns, right? And here's the three states zoomed in with the county boundaries illustrated. The darker the color here, the higher the level of adoption. But you start to see, if you look over here at Indiana, you start to see some counties with high levels of adoption adjacent to counties with low levels of adoption. And you see that across the three states. So a lot of those biophysical variables are controlled for. And so we think it must be some sort of social factor that is impacting cover crop adoption. So what we did is we conducted focus groups in each of the counties that are starred here. So the green counties are ones with higher adoption, and the red stars are lower adoption. And we went and did focus groups in each of those counties. Well, we didn't go anywhere because it was during COVID. We got on Zoom and we did focus groups with conservation professionals and informed folks in those counties to understand what was going on. What we found is that higher levels of cover crop adoption aren't due to just one factor, but really due to a cluster of factors. And you can see those factors here. There's early cover crop adopters in the counties. There's a cover crop culture. There's programs in place beyond EQIP and CSP. Conservation staff are promoting cover crops beyond their regular duties. There's collaboration between agencies and entrepreneurs. a different type of farming, more organic produce, pastured livestock, or smaller scale farms, and more cattle. What I want to, since this is a little case study illustrating the role of norms, zoom in a little bit on a couple of those factors that we found to influence increased cover crop adoption. What you can see here is the gold, the boiler gold colored columns are the counties with high adoption, and the white columns are the counties with lower adoption. And so where we found something, where we found the presence of a factor, we put an X in the column, right? So if we zoom into cover crop culture, we see that virtually every county that had high adoption, we found this culture, right, that was supportive of cover crops. It's hard to define what culture means. It really was, how it came out in the focus groups was people just say, well, people are adopting cover crops. People are talking about cover crops a lot. There's general support. People are, when you go to the coffee shop, people are saying positive things about cover crops. There's lots of people already doing it, so it just becomes this supportive thing. You're seeing it. That really is very much a norm. We see it in a couple of places with lower adoption, but generally it seems to be a trend in these higher adoption counties. Similarly, in this factor here, collaboration between agencies and what we termed entrepreneurs, we found only in the high adoption counties, and we found it in every high adoption county, and we didn't find it in any of the low adoption counties. So this is, again, people working together, right? Either the private sector or farmers, which is also private sector, of course. But we really found this is a collaboration between someone in the county, sort of on the ground, boots on the ground, working directly with agencies, partnering together to promote cover crops. So partnering together to change those norms, to get that conversation, to be supportive of cover crop adoption. So very influential factors. And again, why I think norms is such an important variable. So the final one of the set of three, attitudes, norms, and perceived behavioral control. Perceived behavioral control is getting at whether the person who we're trying to get to adopt a practice actually has control over that practice. And the example I'm going to use here, and I think one of the biggest places it plays out in our region, is with rented lands. So this map here is an illustration of the sparrow model, which is basically nutrient export from the Midwest into the Gulf of Mexico. So that the darker the county, the higher the rates of nutrient export. And it's overlaid with counties that have high levels of rented farmland. And again, the darker the color, it's like this multiplication thing here going on, right? But you see these dark colors concentrated across Iowa, Indiana, and Illinois, and also interestingly, sort of down the actual Mississippi there. But we focused our work in these three I states again for this study I'm going to talk about here to try to understand more about rented lands. It's actually something like over 60% of farmland in these three states is rented. So if you think perceived behavioral control, if you are renting the land, do you actually have the control to do a practice? Is it your decision to say, I want to put in cover crops? Or is it your decision to say, I want to put in a saturated buffer? Probably not. It probably is the landowner's decision, or at least that's the perception on behalf of that tenant. So we did a really major study in partnership with the Nature Conservancy and Johns Hopkins University, where we ultimately enrolled over 2,000 landowners into a randomized experiment. We first did that by actually mailing 40,000 postcards to landowners people who were not farming their own land but owned farmland. We sent them postcards and we asked them if they wanted to learn more about soil health. And then for the people who returned those postcards, which was 2,200 about, non-operating landowners who said they hadn't used cover crops on their land in the last 3 years, we enrolled them into an experiment. So 876 of them got information only. So they received this beautiful packet of information about cover crops that gave them a local person to call in each state, or different contacts in each state, information about what cover crops do for soil health, how to find out more, etc. The next group of people got all of that information, plus they got information on how to write a conservation amendment into a lease so how they could actually get more conservation into their lands that they rented out. And then 479 of the people, we offered them a financial incentive. So we gave them the information, we gave them the lease information, and we offered them $1,500 if they could get cover crops adopted on 40 acres of their rented land. We found 1.5% of people took up our financial offer. So it wasn't wildly successful. What we did find, however, is that when we actually surveyed all of these folks afterwards to see if they had done anything, our work had led to a lot of people had actually talked to their tenants, right? So we saw increased conversation between landowners and tenants around cover crops on the land, which it takes a long time for these decisions to actually matriculate. So I would hope if we went back, this was a couple of years ago now, if we went back this year, we might actually find more cover crops on those lands. But the money itself was not a huge motivator. And the other piece of, there were some economists on this team. I am not an economist. I am a non-economist social scientist. And we'd done some interviews with landowners and tenants before this. And my hypothesis was that money was not going to influence people to do this work, right? The barrier was much bigger than money. The barrier was really landowners and tenants having conversations together and feeling like they each, for the landowner to feel like they had control over what the tenant did, and for the tenant to feel like they could talk to a landowner and say what they would like to do with the land. There's a huge barrier there in terms of perceived control on both sides of that equation. The economists on our team thought that we just hadn't offered enough money. So we mailed 100 people an offer of $5,000 to get cover crops on 40 acres. And there were two bad addresses. So it ended up being 98 people enrolled in that experiment. But only, I think it was 5 of them who took the offer. So we still didn't see a lot of movement, even with the higher financial offer, really suggesting that there are larger factors at play in trying to get practices adopted on rented lands. And I think a large part of that equation, again, goes to trying to change how that control is perceived and trying to get those conversations such that both partners, landowner and tenant, feel like they have some control. All right, so we have attitudes, norms, and procedures. Oh my gosh, did I get disconnected there? Hello?
Yeah, just you froze for a couple seconds and then your screen stopped sharing.
Yeah.
It was a Purdue thing. I had the same thing happen to me.
That's so funny because, yeah, I just suddenly I was spinning and I was coming back in. So, okay, what did you miss? You don't know what you missed.
You were just about to start talking about intention. So I don't think we missed it, just like a second or two.
All right, I don't have to ramble on about rented lands again. That's good.
No.
All right, so intention. So these 3 things, attitudes, norms, perceived behavioral control, collectively inform someone's intention to adopt a behavior. And farmers, unsurprisingly, are like the rest of us fallible humans, and we often intend to do things that we don't actually ever follow up on and do. So we see a lot of inertia, right? We see people making an intention, but then not following through. But the other thing that happens is not only inertia that prevents intention from moving to behavior, it's also this thing called actual control, right? So one might have the best of intentions, but then you go out to actually do something and you find you can't do it. So for example, a farmer might decide to adopt cover crops, and then they go out to buy some cover crop seed and there's no cover crop seed available. Or a farmer might go out and say they're going to spring apply nitrogen, but then they find out that there's actually not enough nitrogen. They can't store that much nitrogen in their county in the spring, and so they have to default back to fall application. So actual control can be really, really important. We see a lot of structural issues sort of emerge in this actual control space. And it's something we don't think enough about, right? But it's definitely something to explore more in terms of what prevents that intention from turning into actual behavior. But ideally, we see intention lead to behavior, which is great. But the next piece of this puzzle is persistence. And that is, does that behavior persist over time in the landscape? Does the farmer continue to do it? Some practices, of course, are much easier to have persistence with, right? If a farmer is going to put in a reconstructed wetland, that hopefully is going to persist for quite a long time because it's an actual effort to remove it. But a practice like no-till or a practice like cover crops, that can change. Most of our funding mechanisms to help farmers get started with something like cover crops are for 3 years, at least through EQIP. And when that money goes away, what happens? Does the farmer continue using it? And there's really not a lot known about persistence, in large part because it's really hard for researchers like me to study this question because of Farm Bill constraints, in that government agencies cannot share with me a list of people who've received funding for me to go out and say, hey, what did you do after your funding went away? We did recently partner with the Indiana NRCS office to do some interviews with producers whose EQIP funding had run out. But the way we had to do this, of course, is that NRCS mailed letters on our behalf to producers, and the letters said, if you would like to be interviewed about what you did with cover crops after your money ran out, please contact these people at Purdue. So you can imagine what happens, right? The people who get a letter like that and then go out of their way to either call us or to take a short survey online to give us their contact information are the people who had a good experience, right? So most of the people who contacted us are people who continued using cover crops. We did get some interviews with people who discontinued, but not as many as I would have liked. But that's sort of the nature of us as researchers trying to get access into this space. But we did learn some things from those interviews. We certainly learned that there are some factors that seem to correlate highly with continued use of cover crops. Those are having a stewardship ethic, so going all the way back to this personal characteristics of having a stewardship ethic that tends to play out all the way through this model and lead to ongoing persistence. Having a learning mentality spoke to ongoing use of cover crops, and finding that benefits outweigh challenges. So the relative advantage of cover crops was found to outweigh disadvantages. But so, that's great, right? And all these people called us and we talked to them who continued using cover crops. But what we did notice, and what they were quite frank about, is that after their EQIP funding expired, they changed how they were using cover crops. So many of them changed the type of cover crop they were planting, they changed their seeding rate, and in many cases, they reduced the number of acres they were using cover crops on. So even though they were persisting, it not necessarily at the level that what we would like to see if we really want to be affecting long-term change on the landscape. So before I wrap up, a couple of things here that often come up, and I talked a little bit about financial incentives, although it says here I didn't, but I can never quite predict what I'm going to say. But I usually don't talk that much about money in these talks because I don't think that money is a very important thing to understand as we think about the adoption decision. So money certainly is necessary, right? So it's obviously adopting these practices costs money, and we have an obligation, I believe, to help farmers with that monetary expense that really benefits all of us. But money is necessary, but not sufficient, right? So having availability of funds is not enough to push somebody over the edge if they still have a negative attitude towards a practice, if the the social norms in their community don't support practice adoption. It doesn't matter if we're offering money, right? We still have other things that we need to change in addition to offering money. And then the other piece of this is knowledge. Often we tend to think, and I find this a lot with students especially, is that if we just tell people what they should do and why it's a good thing, they're going to go do it, right? And it would be lovely if that were the case, but we often don't find that knowledge is a barrier to adoption, right? Especially amongst the farming population. Most farmers know about cover crops, right? It's not a lack of knowledge that is leading to non-adoption. It's those other things. It's the attitudes towards it, or their perceived control over what happens on the land that they're farming, et cetera. Knowledge is a barrier. So I don't think it's usually a barrier with farmers. It can be a barrier with different audiences though. So when we talk to non-operating landowners, especially ones who bought farmland as an investment, or they inherited it, but it hasn't been actively farmed by someone in their family for a couple of generations, they don't have a lot of knowledge about farming practices. And so for the non-operating landowner audience, giving them knowledge is actually the first step to then trying to change attitudes, norms, et cetera, towards getting a practice adopted. But generally amongst farmers, not so much. All right, that wraps me up there. There should be plenty of time for questions, which I'm sure you all have.
Okay, you do see a poll that you are now able to fill out, so please do go ahead and take care of that. We've got one question popping up here in the chat. Linda, your information is fascinating. Leads me to believe that getting agencies, NGOs, private sector to coordinate activities is complicated. We might be able to motivate a few counties to improve support and coordination for the most part. This is just too complicated to operationalize in a majority of counties. Isn't it a lot easier and more effective to just regulate agriculture? What do you think?
Well, define easy. Define getting those regulations passed in Congress. So that's a really, really good question, right? And of course, my whole talk was focused on getting voluntary adoption, except at the beginning where I said one of the background factors can be policies, right? We certainly see a lot more adoption of cover crops in the Chesapeake Bay where they have regulations that really support the use of cover crops. So yes, I mean, yeah, we could all have our own, everyone has a thought on regulation. I think if you could actually enforce regulation and get people to cooperate and follow through, that yes, it would work. We did some focus groups a couple of years ago with what we call the non-choir farmers, right? So these are farmers who have not adopted conservation practices. And this work was funded by the Walton Family Foundation. And so they were really interesting focus groups. It was challenging to get people, those types of farmers in a room, because those are the farmers who don't usually go to things, right? Because they're not adopting things. But when we got them in a room and we had these conversations, they themselves actually in many cases came around to the thought that there needed to be some type of regulation, right? That there are some really bad actors out there. And they're probably not going to ever do anything to stop the soil erosion on their land or other types of things. And so at some base level, there should be some type of regulation. Now, that's what they said in our friendly, confidential focus groups, right? That is not what they would say if they were talking to their state legislature, I am sure. But I do think that there is some understanding that there's probably some base level that probably does need to, I don't know, be regulated, but also supported financially or something. But that'll be a tough sell. So. Yeah.
Okay, very good. Katie's question in the Q&A was very similar, so I'm going to assume that was answered as well. Let me know, Katie, if that's not the case. Coming back over to the chat, we've got Julie Dahl who wants to ask her own question.
Hi, Linda. Thanks. I always learn so much from you. My question has to do with your finding and the finding that, farmers with livestock integrated into their cropping systems might have more uptake of conservation practices. And I'm wondering if you've delved in at all as to why. I'm curious if it's like just a logistics thing, like they have manure and they're going to spread it, and maybe that would help cover crops help them in some way with that, or is it more of like a mental model? So I've heard one farmer say, I have livestock, like I'm used to dealing with like a living organism, and I'm used to dealing with the rumen of my livestock and understanding microbes. And so when I think about my soil, it's the same way. It's a living organism with microbes, and I'm going to treat it the same way with the same care I treat my livestock. So I'm just curious if you could unpack that a little bit.
So I think there's a lot going on, right? And I think exactly what you said, Julie, about that. You didn't use the word systems thinking, but that's what the word that I usually use, right? That farmers who are systems thinkers are more likely to adopt practices, and you see that, right? So someone has livestock, they have to think a different way, right? And so then that translates into how they're thinking about their land management, et cetera. So I think that's certainly one piece of it. We see in Iowa, where there is more grazed livestock than we have in Indiana, we see for cover crops especially a relative advantage of cover crops being that their livestock can can graze and eat the cover crops, right? So it falls into practice characteristics, working really well with livestock in that scenario. There's also just a lot more practices, right? So, and the EQIP funds a lot of practices for livestock, and a certain percentage of the money has to be spent on livestock. So I think that's part of it, as well as just the sheer number of practices that can be supported, that farmers might find beneficial. But certainly that systems thinking piece is a part of it, for sure. Yeah.
So we've got similar vein a question also in the chat. While financial incentives may not increase adaptation, do you find that increased, I think, adoption by those with livestock is due to decreased financial risk?
That's a good question. I don't know the answer, but I would hypothesize that yes, right? That I think when we find more diverse farms, you're going to see, lower risk, right? It's a little bit easier to try something because you've got other things that can buffer that. Across the data, especially our data, I think in Indiana, we don't have that much information on diverse farms. And across the US, I'm trying to think when, like the ERS, Economic Research Service, does a lot of surveys, of course, and they often, when they're doing models of practice adoption, they do include a variable for diversity of the farm operation, and that is usually significant, right? Positively significant. So the more diverse the farm operation is, the more likely you are to see practice adoption. So it can be important, for sure.
Okay. John asked a question that I was trying to wrap my head around as well. Given the importance of support systems, what could we in Extension do to help foster development of a support system in areas where we're trying to encourage conservation practices? Is there a role for the private sector in this? And how do we interact?
Excellent question. And if this wasn't a webinar format, right, and everybody could engage in a discussion, I'm sure between you all, you'd have great stories to share of things you've done that have been successful or things you've tried that haven't been successful. I think one of the things is really trying to have those conversations, right, and getting people in a room together. We did some work up in Saginaw Bay in Michigan a few years ago. It was part of an RCPP, so Regional Conservation Partnership Project, where they were trying to get the private sector, the Michigan Agribusiness Association folks working with NRCS, right, to get farmers to the table to sign up for practices. And we did some interviews at the beginning. As they were just rolling this out, we did some interviews, and we found we found several people, and this is not unique to Michigan, so I'm not picking on Michigan here. This is just where we did the work. But we found some NRCS staff who said they'd never talked to a crop consultant in their life, right? And one of the recommendations that we made to the team working there was that they try to get people in a room together more often. And they started something called Lunch and Learns. The Nature Conservancy sponsored them. Once a month, they brought all these different people together into a room, and they had some sort of programming, but it was also network time, right? And they got people talking to each other. So they got the private sector, the public sector, farmers, everybody in a room talking together, and found that to be very, very beneficial to really start to break down some of those barriers, to see that, obviously, some goals of those different sectors are very different, but trying to understand where there are some similarities and some places to work together and to have some synergies. I like that model.
That's actually my neck of the woods, and that has continued, and we now have farmer to farmer learning opportunities with similar groups throughout the watershed. Something weird in Michigan that might be easy at other people's states is we don't have a lot of independent crop consultants. And so that's what causes some difficulty in communication, I think, between agribusiness and some of our government agencies, or even like myself, I work for MSU Extension, where in other states, you might have that first bridge, which is working with those independent crop consultants, and then you could start to work into some of the other agribusiness professionals. So sorry, I just thought I'd throw that out there.
No, that's great to hear they're still ongoing. But I think that's a great space for Extension to be in, right? It's sort of that boundary organization that helps bring people together as a neutral third party almost.
Okay, we've got a couple more to address. Steve's got a Q&A. In the past, there was a non-scientific survey of farmers asking about the value they've perceived with their use of cover crops. That was a SARE initiative. A majority of farmers reported an increase in yields with the use of cover crops, so farmers make more money using cover crops. Do you believe there's a value difference for the farmer when talking about money between cost share versus increased farm income that the producers actually earn by managing their systems in a way that improves profit?
Oh, that is I don't know the answer. I think ultimately for persistence, right? If we think about that persistence question I talked about at the end, that I think cost share is probably important. Even if farmers hear the message that they could have an increased income, they might not believe it. So the cost share helps them get started. But then they need to start seeing that increased income most likely in order to persist, right? If it doesn't fit in with their own worldview and other things they want to be doing on their farm. So I suspect both are important, but in different ways.
Okay. Tom's got another question in the chat here. You've done a lot of research with non-operating landowners. And of course, we've ruled out financial incentives. But Tom wants to know, what is the answer? They want to be conservationists, but don't seem to want to do the homework to get a good grade.
Okay, I would say we've ruled out financial incentives. We know financial incentives don't work until we've done some other groundwork, right? So just don't say I didn't say financial.
I retreat in that phraseology. Yeah.
But that does speak to, I need to be a little bit clearer in how I present that story as well. Yeah, so that's a good question, Tom. The American Farmland Trust and Women Working for the Land and some other groups have done some work working with women non-operating landowners, where they bring people together. And I'm sure several of you have probably participated in these, right? They bring people together into these learning circles, all women landowners, all women staff, and they share and they learn and they do field days. Those have been found to be effective, right? Those are leading to increased conversations. The problem is they're not impacting a lot of people, right? Because it's very, very intensive. And it's reaching local people, if you will, right? Versus, and I think when I saw Tom's question pop up, and hi Tom, by the way, when I saw his question pop up, he'd written absentee, and I tend to think of absentee landowners being the ones who are like even further distant, right? And the ones who don't have really any contact with the farm, and they're not even around to go to these learning circles. But I do think those learning circles are a good model where they can work. In fact, I know they're a good model, they work. One thing we've been trying to do is figure out who these non-operating landowners talk to, right? Because we found with farmers, right, it's important to know who they talk to, right? And we can work with those influencers. Who are the influencers for non-operating landowners? It's not as clear, right? Non-operating landowners are incredibly diverse. But one thing that many of them do, even these ones who are far away have told us when we talk to them, is they will often call the county extension office where their land is to find out what the current rental rates are. There's an opportunity, right? To not just say this is the current rental rate, but hey, can I sit down with you for an hour and actually talk to you more about programs, opportunities for your land, et cetera, right? So there's potential there, I really think, for extension to be an influencer when that opportunity just presents itself, right? Without even going out of your way necessarily. But trying to figure out who those other influencers are, right? There's the farm management companies, there's lawyers, there's bankers, and then how do we reach those folks and help them pass along some of this information? But there's a lot more work to do in that space, and I hope don't have a better answer. But there's lots of people working in that area now, so hopefully we'll get there and start figuring out some answers.
Excellent. Well, I believe that covers the questions from the audience, and we all really appreciate your time today, Dr. Prokopy, and thank you.
Yes, my pleasure.